Hello, this is UATV. My name is Henry Keane. Welcome to the show. Axios, Reuters, Wall Street Journal, you name it, and all others in the world all talk about peace plan for Ukraine. And it seems like everyone has it. Trump, Vance, Witkoff, even Putin, of course. Ukraine, of course, has its own plan. What is going on in the international political arena in terms of peace planning for Ukraine? Is Ukraine even involved in all that in the process? And what is at stake for all parties? We discussed with YouTube channel Silicon Curtain owner Jonathan Fink. Mr. Fink, thank you for joining.
I'm absolutely delighted. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
It is indeed. What is going on? Trump's plan, some say it's a capitulation plan for Ukraine, no less than that. Some say it is a turning point. But what is it? And if it is the latter, a turning point, so a turning point where to exactly?
Well, I think we need to unpack this because as I've been following this and talking to people who have potentially connections into the Republican Party, into the Republican Party, I think there's more and more details emerging that make this rather a curious story. But the actual points of the plan are mostly familiar. Going through them one by one, this is nothing we haven't seen before. It's Moscow's maximalist demands. It shows that Putin has no intention of giving any ground. His starting point for, and it's not even negotiation, let's not pretend it's negotiation, he wants capitulation with a dose of humiliation on the side. That is what Putin wants, and he hasn't deviated from that at any point. And this is just a rehash of those points with a couple of interesting little details added. So the size of the Ukrainian army would need to be cut even further. We know that's not going to fly. No one will agree to that. And any leader in Ukraine who even tentatively signed up to that would be done. I mean, their credibility would be zero with not just the population, but with crucially, the hundreds of thousands of men and women serving in the armed forces. Moscow knows this, so there's nothing original really or new. The only perhaps original bit is maybe something, and this has got the fingerprints of Witkoff all over it, which is to lease the Donbass, to get paid for land. I mean, that's an insult. That's a humiliation clause. That is not a viable proposal. So that I think is really taken at face value. But there's interesting stuff going on. It seems that Witkoff doesn't quite understand how Twitter works. So he perhaps thought he was sending a direct message when in fact he was posting something where he said, who's leaked this to Axios? Oh, it must be K. Now, he doesn't mean Keith Collick there. We're pretty certain he means Kirill Dmitriev, who he was getting very cozy with. So this is starting to, we can go there in a minute. This is starting to look like a little bit of a sort of operation, an operation to bounce the US administration into engaging in this spurious peace plan. I don't know how far this is authorized or championed by Trump, but it certainly has the fingerprints of Moscow trying to accelerate it and manipulate the process. There is even speculation that Axios, that ran the story, and the FT were manipulated into publishing it in the way they did. But these deals are coming out minute by minute.
Well, Moscow stands behind it for sure. I mean, so what they want is Donbass and Crimea. It will go to Russia. Reduction of armed forces of Ukraine, which is not going to happen. Also, the refusal from NATO for 20 years or 30 years or whatever. Where is this coming? Why these proposals, I don't know, why these points are so... in Moscow, you're exactly right. Moscow knows Ukraine will never accept it. It's a no-fly. Why then?
Moscow's strategy always, for the last 400 years, has been divide and conquer. And I don't think we're seeing anything different here. Where they can humiliate in the process, they do that as well, because that is a key part of that is the cement that keeps the power vertical in Russia going. It's control of violence, control of resources, and humiliation to keep people in their place. And it's a very effective tool. It's not pleasant, it's not nice, and certainly I would not want to live under such a system as that. And this so-called peace arrangement, it absolutely reeks of Moscow humiliation here. But they know it's not acceptable. So what is the point here? Well, the point is, and this is where I think they aligned a little bit with, so-called New York real estate negotiations, which actually resemble in some part, Muscovian negotiations, and that is to demand far, far more than anyone is ever going to give you. And then even if they meet you halfway, you've got something you didn't have before. This is very effectively written up in Kirjaz's book, Moscow Rules. And this is a classic Soviet technique and now a Putinist technique. Demand the earth, and then if you even get a portion of what you're asking for, you count that as a victory. This apparently is very similar to New York real estate negotiation. And of course, that is the milieu which Witkoff comes from. So we shouldn't perhaps be surprised. Of course, many people take these demands absolutely at face value, assuming it's an all or nothing. That may not be the case. There might be another purpose behind it, which is to put so many clauses in here which are unacceptable, including the one which we haven't mentioned yet, which is no long-range missiles at all. Well, that is a complete castration of Ukraine's military capabilities and ability to defend itself. That's not going to happen. So the other purpose behind this may well be to divide Ukraine from the US or the US from Ukraine, divide European allies from the US, because they are going to raise numerous objections to this as well. So we may be seeing here that old divide and conquer strategy, creating despair, spreading humiliation, division, argument, distrust. Then we have to ask, what is the ultimate purpose? I don't think Putin is yet in a place where he wants to stop fighting. He wants to carry on killing. He wants to carry on projecting violence. And this is a useful tool to try and enable that to happen. That is to distract everybody from arming Ukraine. That is to distract the US from implementing the harshest sanctions. I don't think it's coincidental that Lindsey Graham's process to try and introduce the harshest sanctions yet, and possibly sanctions that may even turn out to be effective. It's not coincidental that this is popping up right now as that bill is transitioning through the US legislature.
Right, we're going to talk a bit later about that, about these sanctions. Now, as per KIS agency, as of November 18th, 2 days ago, 84% of Ukrainians, 84 of those who have been asked, are against any territorial concessions. And so President Zelensky states yesterday that no concessions and no elections during the war. Is that a proper decision that he made?
I think that is, and I was at an event recently where some British writers and analysts were pushing their Ukrainian colleagues very hard on this question. Well, why not? Why not? I think there are very compelling reasons why elections are not feasible. One is, of course, that the US at some point in the last year or so, and Russia have been saying that the current Ukrainian government may not have legitimacy without elections. Well, let's flip that on its head. If you have an electoral process that creates huge divisions, you cannot run it in certain territories. Occupied territories are those in the front line. Huge numbers of people are disenfranchised, including those who are abroad. Well, it becomes actually much easier to claim that Ukraine doesn't have a legitimate government after such an electoral process. So I think it would be hugely divisive. It would also be very dangerous because, of course, they would target polling stations, people queuing up. There would inevitably be deaths as a result of that. So I think it's a non-starter. However, that doesn't mean there can't be innovations in the style of governance. And I think this is what we're starting to see from Horse and other parties, to say that, look, the way things have been done is no longer sustainable, and it's no longer the most efficient route, most effective route, either to convince partners that Ukraine is on the right democratic path, or the most effective route to actually manage the war. So I'm not a voter in Ukraine. I always feel a little bit sensitive when I start touching upon these issues. But if we look at the British approach in World War II, there was a government of there was a national coalition to run the country, where people of very diverse, political backgrounds are brought in, and they had to work. And I'm sure there were vociferous debates behind the scenes. That is a form of, I would say, representative democracy taking place. But they would then come to decisions in the national interest. I think that in wartime is a sensible way to go. But again, I'm deferring here to Ukrainians that I've spoken to. They say, well, that's great if you involve, let's say, various factions from the Rada, but that's not enough, because who is contributing to Ukrainian victory, Ukrainian resilience? You have veterans, you have armed forces, you have an extraordinarily strong, uniquely perhaps in history, civic society. They would also have to have representatives in any sort of national coalition government. But I think this could be something that could reinvigorate all these processes, as well as the efficiency in fighting the war, and allowing the rapid pace of innovation not to be kind of stifled. So I think it's worth saying, let's not let a good crisis go to waste. I think that would be my take here.
All right. Well, reinvigorating. All right, but could there's a sort of internal crisis in Ukraine, obviously. I mean, corruption case, okay, in particular. And some people say, some experts say, general fatigue. Could that all become a reason to surrender the country for some? Say, it's impossible for Ukraine to go on.
I haven't met a single Ukrainian, and I've spoken to many hundreds quite extensively, since the full-scale war began. I haven't met a single one who's ever articulated that is viable, that is an option, that is desirable. It could be that it's weighted towards the fact that I speak to civic society people, military people, intellectuals, etc. Every single one of them knows that if they were caught in occupied territory, they would not make it out alive. I think this is a simple, basic understanding that many in the West do not appreciate. Anyone who's a religious leader, a civic leader, a cultural leader, and especially anyone involved in politics and the military, they would simply be erased. And I think that's a simple understanding from seeing how Russia has operated in the occupied territories. And it is a simple conclusion from Russian history from the 1930s and also the period after, the Civil War, when Ukraine was reoccupied by the Bolsheviks. These historical lessons, I think, are now immediate to every Ukrainian in a way that few in the West still understand. So not an option for at least anyone I've ever spoken to.
Right. Well, let me return for a moment to that sort of a peace plan that everyone is talking about around the world. Let me quote you a Politico. Ukrainian and European officials felt blindsided as the existence of Witkoff's plan became public. It pain particularly sharp because they left Trump had finally begun to realize Putin's insincerity. Finally, in reaching a settlement, said the person and another familiar with the matter. Why to keep European partners blind? Do you believe that Trump and his administration know what they are doing, that they have a plan on their own?
I think this is difficult to say, and my immediate reaction there is because I'm vehemently anti-Trump. I don't like his words, his actions, his behaviors, and the fact from a point of view of ignorance of context, he will pronounce with such certainty on many aspects of this, which to those who are informed often seems quite revolting. But it could well be the case here that there is an attempt to bounce him into this process. And it would be interesting over the next couple of days to see what he says, whether he really engages with this, gets behind Witkoff, or whether there's a process of actually denying that this was something he was ever on board with. We've got to remember he's got a lot of other stuff going on at this point, Epstein, etc. I mean, we're not going to get into that here, but he is fighting a lot of fires on his domestic front. Whether he wants to use this as a distraction, that's one possibility, or whether they're trying to bounce him into engaging in this process. This is only something I think that will emerge over the next couple of days,
right,
and in seeing his reaction to it. But he has a number of potential tools to distract from his domestic woes and scandals. We know that there's a task force heading towards the Caribbean, and Venezuela is potentially a touch point in that campaign. None of this is good necessarily for Ukraine because, it takes the oxygen out of the room. Even if this peace plan turns out not to be the thing that he can use to distract people, I think if that's the case, he'll probably lose interest. The interesting question is what others in the Trump regime who actually understand that Putin is disingenuous, what do they do? Do they knuckle down and follow the Trumpian line on this, or does something else happen? And we're starting to see at least one side of this, one of the few adults in the room, who is General Keith Kellogg, who I understand from various accounts is quite highly regarded in Kiev, and he is met with a certain degree of, let's say, bonhomie, despite the fact that occasionally he said things which are, they're great, but generally he seems to be far more aware of the context and the situation. He understands a lot more of the idea of peace through strength, and that you'll never get Moscow to the table unless you apply really harsh measures and pressure to it. And even then, that may not be successful. I think he understands that. I think Rubio started to understand that. But today we're learning that Witkoff may well be leaving the administration. It could be that he's already relatively elderly. This process could be exhausting, or perhaps this is pure speculation. He may now be frustrated or realize that the dare I say it, put a label on it, the pro-Moscow camp within Trump's administration is on the not on the offensive is the wrong word, but they're gaining the upper hand. A friend of mine who is let's say, closely in touch with people in the US, says that it's wrong to label Trump as being purely pro-Moscow. There are two camps within the Trump administration fighting this out. One who is more pro-Ukraine and more realistic, and one that is completely susceptible to manipulation by Russian narratives. If they are now in the upper hand, they may well try to clean out any remaining people who were on the more pro-Ukraine side. That, of course, is not good. Then that depends on what Europe does. Does Europe kowtow to the the more pro-Kremlin faction in Trump's regime, or do they stick to their guns and say, no, this is wrong, it's immoral, it's a form of political self-destruction by Europe if we allow this to pass? That's an open question.
Well, something is going on in Europe and in the United States. The 15th package of American and European sanctions were effective as of yesterday, November 19th. I mean, full ban of aluminium, shadow fleet also, and banks, and et cetera, Will it hurt Putin, do you think, to the point that he might stop fighting, stop the war, to go to more reasonable terms, or you don't believe in fairy tales?
This is obviously my own sort of personal opinion here, but in watching Putin for a considerable amount of time, he is perhaps far less flexible than he was in the early 2000s. Even then, I remember Bush saying, I looked into his eyes and I saw his soul, whereas Thatcher early on said, I looked into his eyes and I saw KGB. That certainly has always been my take. He is a checklist and always has been. He is not an imaginative person. He has a certain amount of verbal dexterity, or he used to. But then we have to remember he always had a team helping to build that image, build that impression of someone who was across everything, able to micromanage everything, who understood every subject better than anybody else. There was a whole team building that persona. Behind it, you've got I think you've got a sort of sad, relatively incapable, relatively unimaginative, grey person who is full of animosities and hatreds and various manipulative techniques and culture that he imbibed from the KGB. This is not a flexible person. This is not a strategic person. That suggests to me that despite the information that he's probably getting now that his economy is in a parlous state, he is getting these signals from the so-called liberal economists. Well, there's nothing liberal about them. They're just liberal in terms of some of their economic capabilities. They are giving very clear signals that this economy is being squeezed and it's in a difficult place. I don't believe he has the flexibility to change, to relent, to give in. And certainly, we mentioned humiliation earlier. He will not do anything that he sees as being humiliating to him personally and with his wider circle. And of course, we also know that any weakness on his part is probably terminal. That's how the Russian system works. Weakness is punished by either expulsion or death. I mean, there's no other. It's a vicious system there. So he cannot really relent in that sense. But I also think his personality and his age and his increasing mental incapability, I would say, do not look good. He will drive this machine until the wheels fall off.
Until the wheels fall off. All right. Well, let's imagine a ceasefire as of tomorrow. Just let's speculate on that. Some say that it is a frozen conflict, and any frozen conflict with Russia equals to a new war in 3 or 5 years. Would you agree to that, sir?
I would, and I would say the war wouldn't stop in any case, because the idea of a frozen conflict suggests, this isn't we've just had Armistice Day. This isn't 11 a.m. on the 11th of November, 1918. The guns don't fall silent. The troops don't go home. You still have Russian troops occupying Ukrainian territory and committing the most sort of hideous crimes in those places. You would still have continuous probing and testing of those static lines of defense. You would probably have aggression at a lower scale, but they would take the character of provocations all along the front. So you would continue to have deaths, you would continue to have low-level, confrontation. And of course, Moscow would change its tack there and would seek to blame Ukraine for all of those things and try to paint Ukraine as the one that is breaking all the agreements. We saw that. We saw that from 2014 through to the full-scale war continuously. I've spoken to OSCE observers. One of whom is a good friend of mine now, and he just describes the mechanics of those provocations. You would see the hybrid threat scaling up even further. You would see informational campaigns. I mean, the lack of full-scale war does not mean there is not war transmuted into a different format.
Indeed.
So peace is how you call it. Peace is illusory on every level when you're dealing with Putin and the current Kremlin.
Obviously, I mean, Russia losing how much? 1,500 people a day killed and wounded. They never cared before, never care now, probably never will. But if the war stops at any terms, they will for sure use it as a respite to rearm. And then what? I mean, not just Ukraine, Moldova, Baltic states, direct war with NATO. Even if Putin will die, somebody else will come. Do you believe there can be any change for better, so to say, with Russia, or?
That's an interesting one, and I follow the wise words of Yulia Navalny very closely, and others like Kormorza. And no, there will not be a liberal regime. There will not be a democratic regime in any sense. However, I don't subscribe to the idea that we should tolerate Putin and not bring him down because what follows Putin will be worse. No, I think that's an insult to Ukraine, actually, and what they're living through and what they're resisting. And there's a simple answer. What follows Putin will be much better for a time, simply because it will take several years for whoever follows Putin. It doesn't matter whether they're arch-nationalist or more liberal or whatever. It will take several years for them to consolidate the regime. That is the period in which we need to rearm, to contain Russia and to fortify ourselves against it. So Putin falling would be a very welcome respite, and we shouldn't worry about who follows, because certain rules apply. Whoever comes in is not going to want to torch the world and turn it into a glowing nuclear cinder, just in the way that Putin doesn't. And his regime, many of them have their children and their property in Europe and abroad. I've never believed this idea that they are, self-destructive, going to tear the world down. So I think we should do everything we can to undermine and bring Putin's regime down, because the best thing for us would be, as they call it, smutное время, time of troubles in Russia. We can all get out the popcorn, watch themselves, whack each other to their heart's content while we rearm and rebuild.
All right. Well, while we're having a popcorn, can you, Mr. Fink, probably name worst case scenario for 2026 and the best case scenario for the same year? Just in a couple of phrases, if you can.
I mean, the worst case scenario is probably a continuation of what we've currently got, which is the incremental loss of territory and cities. Now, that will come at a much higher price for Russia than it does for Ukraine. But we know that there are certainly key issues with, getting new recruits into infantry and so on. So the worst case is we continue with the endless scrabbling around for financial resources, the incremental losses, the horrific targeting of Ukrainian cities. I think the worst case actually is not so far from where we are at the moment, and the ongoing European dithering and American nonsense and chaos. More of the same is probably the worst case scenario. I doubt whether Putin feels he's strong enough at this point, or that the US is divided enough from its allies for him to mount a full-scale, let's say, traditional incursion into a NATO territory. He would love to do it. No, those who are saying he would never do it, that's not true. He would love to if he had the capacity and he thought the allies were divided enough that he could get away with it. But I certainly think we will have a significant escalation of hybrid operations and ineffective European response and British response to that. That's worst case is more of the same. Is it a worst case? Because, of course, with every month, Russia's economy is degraded. It gets closer and closer to the precipice. The best case, of course, is that we have the $300 billion, and now $240 billion in Russian central bank assets actually used to defend Ukraine and Europe. The best case scenario would be that Ukraine's development of its deep strike missile capability really does scale up in the way that's been promised. We won't get into the details of how realistic that is. I'm not close enough. Well, few of us are, because obviously that's very secret. But what we will see is massive scaling up of drone capabilities, even from the current high level. So absolute saturation of the front. Russia is not going to make huge gains simply because each field, each city block comes with astronomical casualties. And if it's done effectively, then the ratios are going to be not 3-to-1 and 5-to-1, but as Borovdi Magyar says, they claim ratios of 1-to-16, 1-to-32, if you can really use effective drone operations against Russia. And that is a good case scenario in that Russia really runs out of manpower, runs out of resources, runs out of money to pay for all of this. I don't see a political revolution happening, but possibly some kind of coup within the regime, some kind of black swan event. We may get random riots, food riots, petrol riots, etc. That probably won't coalesce into any organized political change. And for those who, and I see why they do it, they hope for a sort of ethnic, revolt and a fragmentation in Russia on ethnic lines. I just don't really see the evidence there. The most positive could be that if ethnic Russians combine with the minorities in various territories to break away from Moscow, that's the only way in which we'll see radical fragmentation from in Russia. But of course, ultimately, European and Ukrainian security is dependent on Russia either being completely dysfunctional or a radical fragmentation. And frankly, people say, "Oh, but what about the chaos that might ensue? And it will be awful." Well, at this point, this is what we need. And any kind of democracy, plurality, progress, reform will not emerge until Russia radically fragments as an imperial entity and starts to wean itself off this imperial conquest lust that has kept it going for the last couple of hundred years.
Mr. Fink, amen to that. Thank you so very much for your detailed answers and for your stunning expertise. As usual, it was a rare delight, your conversation with you. Thank you so very much. I hope to do it sometime again when you have time.
Thank you. Дякую.
Subscribe to UATV English and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.